She was just an ordinary woman, struggling to survive, with barely enough to feed herself. But one cold night, Angela Williams saw 3 homeless children on the street sand. Instead of walking away, she took them in. She gave them warmth. She gave them love. She gave them a home. What Angela didn't know was that her act of kindness would one day save her own life, because years later, Angela was wrongfully convicted of a crime she didn't commit, sentenced to life in prison. For 25 years, she lived behind bars, forgotten by the world. But those 3 children never forgot her. The same children she had rescued grew up to become fighters for justice, for truth, for her, and against all odds, they proved her innocence, freeing her from a life sentence she never deserved. Angela's story isn't just about survival, about love, sacrifice, and how one act of kindness can change the course of history. She thought she was saving them, but in the end, they were the ones who saved her. They say that one act of kindness can ripple through time in ways we can never imagine. For one woman, that act of kindness was taking in 3 children who had nowhere to go, no one to turn to, and nothing to their names. She never thought of herself as a hero, never imagined that the choice she made on one cold night would one day come back to save her. But years later, when her life took a devastating turn, it was those very same children who returned, grown and powerful, determined to rescue the woman who had once rescued them. This is the story of Angela Williams, a Black woman whose compassion and strength shaped 3 lives forever. And how 25 years later, those 3 lives stopped her from spending the rest of her days behind prison walls. Angela's story begins in the early 1990s, in a city where poverty pressed down like an unshakable weight. She was a single mother, raising her own young daughter while working double shifts at a diner. Her life was a constant struggle between paychecks, overdue bills, and the dream of something better. The neighborhood she lived in wasn't easy. Crime was common, and opportunities were scarce. But Angela carried herself with quiet dignity, working hard, helping neighbors when she could, and making sure her daughter never went to bed hungry. She didn't have much, but what she had, she shared. One bitterly cold winter evening, as Angela walked home from a late shift, she spotted something unusual near an abandoned storefront. At first, she thought her tired eyes were playing tricks on her, but as she got closer, her heart sank. 3 children, thin, shivering, and huddled together for warmth, were sitting on the frozen ground. The oldest couldn't have been more than 12, while the youngest looked no older than 5. Their faces were hollow, their clothes dirty, and their eyes held the kind of pain children should never know. Angela stopped in her tracks. She could have kept walking. Many others had, but she simply couldn't. She crouched down and asked where their parents were. The children said nothing at first, only staring at her with wary eyes. Finally, the oldest whispered that their mother was gone and their father, well, he hadn't been around in a long time. They had been sleeping wherever they could, stealing scraps of food and hiding from the world. Angela felt her chest tighten. She thought of her own daughter, safe at home under warm blankets. And in that moment, she made a choice that would change everything. She took the children's cold hands and said, "Come with me." That night, she gave them soup, blankets, and a safe place to sleep. Her small apartment was already cramped, but she made space. What started as one night turned into a week. That week turned into months, and soon, Angela was raising not just her daughter, but 3 more children who weren't even hers by blood. Her neighbors whispered behind her back, saying she was taking on too much, that she couldn't afford to care for more mouths. But Angela didn't care. She knew what it was like to struggle, and she refused to let those children be swallowed by the streets. Life was anything but easy. There were days Angela went without eating so the children could have full plates. There were mornings she left before sunrise and returned long after sunset, exhausted from her shifts, only to help with homework and tuck each child into bed. She couldn't buy them fancy clothes, but she made sure they were clean, fed, and loved. She taught them discipline, respect, and hope. She reminded them every single day that they mattered. Slowly, the children began to smile again. They began to believe in themselves, and under Angela's roof, they found not just shelter, but a family. Years passed. The children grew, went to school, and began to carve out futures that once seemed impossible. Angela's daughter became like a sister to them, and together they shared laughter, fights, and dreams. Angela would often sit on the porch at night, watching them play, feeling a quiet sense of pride. She never asked for thanks. She never thought about recognition. For her, it was simple. Those kids needed her, and she was there. She believed. That was the end of the story. But life, as it often does, had other plans. In the mid-2000s, Angela's world was turned upside down. One evening, while walking home from a grocery store, she stumbled into a confrontation in her neighborhood. 2 men were arguing in the street, voices raised, tempers flaring. Angela, ever the peacemaker, tried to calm the situation, urging them to walk away before things got worse. But the fight escalated quickly. Shouts turned into shoves, and then into violence. In the chaos, someone pulled a weapon. A shot rang out. When the police arrived, confusion reigned. Witnesses gave conflicting stories. And in the end, Angela, who had been there trying to help, was accused of being involved in the crime. She was shocked. She pleaded her innocence, insisting she had nothing to do with the violence. But the system was stacked against her. Prosecutors painted her as a woman with a hidden dark side, twisting her presence at the scene into evidence of guilt. Her history of struggling in a poor neighborhood was used against her, and in a devastating turn, the jury found her guilty. Angela Williams was sentenced to life in prison. The day the verdict was read, her knees buckled. She thought of her daughter. She thought of the 3 children she had raised as her own, and she thought of the long, cold years that now stretched ahead of her. She was led away in handcuffs, her dreams, her sacrifices, and her freedom ripped away behind bars. Angela felt forgotten. The world moved on. The kids she had saved had grown into adults, living their own lives. She feared that her act of kindness had been swallowed by time, erased by the weight of her sentence. But what Angela didn't know was that those 3 children had never forgotten her, not for a single day. When Angela sat in her prison cell, the walls seemed to close in tighter every year. The days blended into one another, marked only by the clang of cell doors and the harsh calls of correctional officers. 25 years is a lifetime to lose. She missed birthdays, graduations, and all the little moments that make life worth living. The hardest part wasn't the food or the cold or the endless routine, it was the silence. She wondered every night if the children she had once cared for even remembered her. She feared that she had become just another forgotten name. erased by time and distance. But far beyond those prison walls, the 3 children she had saved never forgot. To them, Angela wasn't just a woman who had given them food and shelter. She was their mother, their protector, their teacher. She was the reason they survived childhood at all. And as they grew into adults, that gratitude turned into determination. They had promised themselves long ago that they would one day repay her sacrifice. And when they learned she had been sentenced to life, they knew they couldn't sit by and let it happen. The oldest, Marcus, had always been the responsible one, the one who tried to shield his younger siblings during their years on the streets. Angela's discipline and guidance had shaped him into a man of principle. Inspired by her, he worked his way through college, then law school. He became a defense attorney, specializing in wrongful convictions. Every case he took on reminded him of the woman who had taught him what justice should look like. But Angela's case wasn't just another file on his desk. It was personal. He made it his life's mission to fight for her freedom. The second child, Denise, had grown up with a sharp mind and a curious spirit. Angela had encouraged her to read every book she could get her hands on, to question everything, to never let the world silence her voice. Denise became a journalist, known for exposing corruption and injustice. She built a reputation for telling stories the world wanted to ignore. When she learned about Angela's conviction, she didn't just see a headline, she saw her mother's life stolen. She vowed to use her platform to bring the truth to light. The youngest, Jamal, had once been the most fragile of the 3, the one who barely spoke when Angela first took him in. But under her care, he found strength. As an adult, he became a community organizer, working to uplift the same kind of neighborhoods where he and his siblings had once struggled. He believed in giving people a voice, in fighting back against systems that tried to silence them. And when it came to Angela, he rallied everyone he could, building a movement to demand her release. Together, the 3 of them formed an unbreakable team. Marcus attacked the case from a legal angle, digging into the trial transcripts, the police reports, and the evidence that had been overlooked. Denise wrote article after article, exposing the flaws in the prosecution's case, showing the world how an innocent woman had been condemned. And Jamal organized protests, community gatherings, and campaigns that forced people to pay attention. They didn't just whisper Angela's name, they shouted it from the rooftops. It wasn't easy. The justice system resists change. Courts don't like to admit mistakes. For years, their efforts seemed to hit walls. Petitions were denied, appeals were dismissed, and Angela remained behind bars. But the children she raised refused to give up. Every setback only fueled their determination. They remembered the nights she went hungry so they could eat. The mornings she woke up exhausted but still managed to smile at them. The love she had poured into them when she had so little to give. They couldn't abandon her. Not now, not ever. And slowly cracks began to appear in the walls of injustice. Marcus uncovered evidence that the prosecution had suppressed key witness statements that could have cleared Angela from the start. Denise published a groundbreaking expose that went viral, drawing national attention to Angela's case. Jamal brought thousands of people into the streets, demanding freedom for the woman who had saved them. Public pressure mounted. Politicians, judges, and even celebrities began to take notice. What once seemed impossible now began to feel within reach. Inside prison, Angela heard whispers of the movement growing outside. At first, she couldn't believe it. Could it really be true that the children she had raised were fighting for her after all these years? When letters from Marcus, Denise, and Jamal finally reached her, tears streamed down her face. They wrote to her not as lost children, but as proud adults. They told her to hold on. They told her justice was coming. For the first time in decades, Angela felt hope. After 25 long years, the breakthrough finally came. Marcus's relentless legal work uncovered enough evidence of misconduct and errors that the case was reopened. A new hearing was scheduled. Angela was brought into the courtroom once again, but this time the energy was different. Sitting in the front row were the 3 children she had once saved, now grown, successful, and powerful. They watched as Marcus stood up, not as a scared boy this time, but as a seasoned attorney, fighting for the woman who had once fought for him. He laid out the evidence, piece by piece. He showed how witnesses had been silenced, how prosecutors had ignored the truth, how the system had failed Angela from the very beginning. Denise sat behind him, scribbling notes, already preparing the article that would tell the world how justice was finally being served. Jamal filled the courtroom with supporters, their chants echoing in the streets outside. The pressure was undeniable. The truth was undeniable. And finally, the judge made a decision. Angela's conviction was overturned. Her life sentence was thrown out. After 25 years behind bars, Angela Williams was free. When she walked out of the prison gates, the sun felt blinding, the air overwhelming. She took a step forward, trembling, unsure if it was real. But then she saw them, the 3 children she had once saved, standing there waiting for her. No longer lost, no longer broken, but strong, successful, and whole. They ran to her, wrapping their arms around her in an embrace that erased years of pain. Angela sobbed as she held them, whispering over and over, my babies, my babies." They told her, "You saved us, now we saved you." For Angela, freedom was sweet, but sweeter still was knowing that her act of kindness all those years ago had not been forgotten. The love she gave had come back to her, multiplied 1,000 times. She had saved 3 children from the streets, and in return they had saved her from a life in prison. It was proof that kindness never dies, that love always finds its way back, and that even the smallest acts can echo through generations. Angela's story spread across the nation, inspiring millions. People saw in her journey a reminder of resilience, of sacrifice, and of the power of family, whether by blood or by choice. And for Angela, the greatest victory wasn't just her freedom. It was standing side by side with the children she had once taken in, watching them live the lives she had always dreamed for them, and knowing that her love had truly changed the world. Freedom was something Angela had dreamed of for 25 long years. But when it finally came, it didn't feel real at first. The world she stepped into was not the same one she had left behind. Technology had changed. The skyline of the city was different, and even the smallest things, like the sound of traffic, the feel of fresh clothes, or the freedom to walk into a store felt overwhelming. She had lost decades, years that could never be returned. But as she looked at the faces of the 3 people who now stood by her side, she knew she had not lost everything. She had her family back, and that was enough. The first days after her release were filled with tears, laughter, and long conversations. Angela sat at the dinner table, surrounded by Marcus, Denise, and Jamal, along with her own daughter, who had never stopped believing in her mother's innocence. They told stories of their childhood, of how Angela's sacrifices had shaped them. They spoke about nights spent studying by candlelight, mornings when she walked miles just to save bus money for them, and the way she always insisted they could be more than the world told them they could be. Angela listened with tears in her eyes, realizing for the first time how deeply her love had changed them. But life after prison wasn't simple. Angela had to learn how to live again. She had to relearn how to use a cell phone, how to navigate a city where self-checkout machines and digital kiosks had replaced the things she once knew. Crowds made her nervous, and loud noises sometimes made her flinch. There were nights when she woke up in a panic, still expecting to hear the clang of prison bars. But every time she stumbled, one of the children she had raised was there to steady her. Marcus helped her with paperwork, guiding her through the legal maze of re-entering society. He reminded her that she no longer had to fight alone. Denise set up interviews, told her story in newspapers and television segments, and made sure Angela's name was not forgotten again. Jamal brought her into the community meetings he organized, introducing her as a symbol of resilience and justice. Together, they surrounded her with the same love and strength she had once given them. Soon, Angela began to find her footing. She started speaking publicly about her experience, standing on stages in front of crowds, her voice steady even as her hands trembled. She told people about the dangers of wrongful convictions, about the cracks in a system that had stolen decades from her, and about the importance of compassion. Her story wasn't just one of tragedy, was one of hope, of family, and of how love can endure through even the darkest times. People listened, not just because of what she endured, but because of who she was. A woman who had once given everything for 3 children, and who had been repaid in the most extraordinary way. The bond between Angela and her children only grew stronger. Holidays that had once been spent apart were now filled with laughter around the dinner table. Birthdays that had passed uncelebrated in prison became joyful reunions. Angela often sat quietly in the corner of these gatherings, just watching, her heart swelling with gratitude. She no longer worried about whether her sacrifices had been worth it. She could see the answer in front of her. Marcus, with his sharp mind and unyielding sense of justice. Denise, with her powerful voice and fearless truth-telling. Jamal, with his fire to lift up others who had once been voiceless. And her daughter, who had grown into a strong, resilient woman, standing proud beside her siblings. Angela knew she had missed much of their lives. She hadn't been there for high school, graduations, first jobs, or the small milestones that mark a family's journey. But instead of mourning what was lost, she chose to celebrate what had been found. She told them often, "You are my legacy. You are the proof that love never goes to waste." And every time they reminded her that she was more than their mother, she was their hero. As the years passed, Angela began working with organizations dedicated to prison reform and children's advocacy. She became a mentor to young people facing struggles like the ones her children had once faced. She poured into others the same compassion that had once guided her to take in 3 homeless kids on a freezing night so many years ago. Her story became a symbol not just of injustice, but of the power of kindness to change the world. And through it all, the children never left her side. When she spoke in front of crowds, Marcus often stood nearby, making sure she felt safe. When reporters asked questions, Denise was there to ensure the truth was told. And when community members reached out for help, Jamal was ready to connect them with resources, standing proudly beside the woman who had first taught him what it meant to fight for others. Angela often thought back to that cold night in the 1990s when she first saw 3 frightened children huddled together in the dark. She could have walked away. She could have decided it wasn't her problem. But instead, she chose love. That choice cost her more than she could have ever imagined. But in the end, it also gave her more than she ever dreamed possible. 20 years of her life had been stolen, but those years had not been wasted. They had been invested in the lives of 3 children who grew up to carry her spirit forward. They had become her justice, her freedom, her redemption. And in their eyes, she had never been a prisoner. She had always been their mother, their protector, and their guiding light. Angela Williams lived the rest of her life not as a victim of the system, but as a living testimony to the power of compassion. She knew the world could be cruel, but she also knew kindness could be stronger. And every time she looked at Marcus, Denise, and Jamal, she was reminded of one simple truth: the love you give away always finds its way back. Angela's freedom was not just a personal victory, it became a spark that ignited change far beyond her own life. When word spread about her case, about the years she had lost and the children who had saved her, people from across the nation were moved. Activists, church leaders, students, and even lawmakers reached out, wanting to hear from her, to learn from her, to understand how something so tragic could happen and yet end in such powerful redemption. Angela's name became a symbol of resilience, and her story turned into a call to action. But for Angela, the most important part was not the recognition. It was the simple, everyday joys that she had once thought were lost forever. She loved waking up without chains on her wrists, drinking coffee on the porch as the sun rose, hearing the laughter of her family filling the house. These ordinary moments were extraordinary to her because for 25 years she had been denied them. Every morning felt like a gift. Every evening felt like a blessing. Still, she carried the weight of her years in prison. She often spoke honestly about the loneliness, the hopelessness, and the countless nights she cried herself to sleep. But she also shared how she survived those years by holding on to memories of the children she had raised. Whenever she felt herself slipping into despair, she would picture Marcus's determined eyes, Denise's sharp questions, and Jamal's quiet smile. She imagined them growing up, thriving, living the lives she wanted for them. And now, seeing them in front of her every day, successful and unbroken, was proof that her hope had not been in vain. Marcus often reminded her of the lessons she had once taught him. He would sit with her at the kitchen table, legal briefs spread out in front of him, and say, "You told me once that the truth always finds its way. That's why I became a lawyer. That's why I never stopped fighting for you." Denise, ever the storyteller, would record Angela's memories, promising to preserve them in a book one day. "Your story isn't just ours, Mama," she'd say, "it belongs to the world." And Jamal, with his boundless energy, constantly pulled Angela into his community work. "You're living proof that we can overcome," he told her. "People need to see you, to hear you, to know it's possible." Angela didn't always feel like a hero. To her, she was just a woman who had made a choice to love. But as she stood on stages and looked into the eyes of young people who hung on her every word, she began to understand the power of her story. She saw teenagers from broken homes who felt hopeless, mothers struggling to raise their children alone, men and women who had lost faith in justice. And when she told them about her journey, the sacrifices, the pain, the triumph, they stood taller, believing that if Angela could survive and still shine with love, so could they. Her life after prison was not without struggles. There were still nights when memories of the cold cell walls haunted her dreams. There were still moments when the weight of lost years pressed down on her. But instead of letting it crush her, Angela used that pain as fuel. She poured it into speeches, into mentorship, into late-night talks with young people who reminded her of herself and the children she once took in. One of her proudest moments came when Marcus invited her to his office to meet a Cleanta young man wrongfully accused, much like Angela had once been. As she sat across from him, holding his trembling hands, she told him, "I know what it feels like to think the world has forgotten you. But you are not forgotten, and you are not alone." The young man broke down in tears. And in that moment, Angela realized that her suffering had not been wasted. It had been transformed into strength for others. Denise eventually published Angela's story, and the book became a national bestseller. It wasn't just about the injustices, it was about the love that had carried them all through. It told the world about the night Angela found 3 homeless children, about the sacrifices she made, and about how those children, now adults, had returned to save her. Readers were moved to tears, and many were inspired to act, volunteering, donating, and standing up against wrongful convictions. Jamal took Angela with him to community rallies, where she spoke alongside him to crowds hungry for change. Her words carried a weight no politician or activist could match, because she spoke from lived experience. When she stood before thousands, her voice steady, her eyes bright, people listened. She reminded them that injustice can break bodies, but not spirits, that love can outlast hate, and that even the smallest acts of kindness can change the course of history. Through it all, Angela never stopped being a mother first. She loved cooking meals for her children and grandchildren, sitting with them late into the night, telling stories, laughing, sometimes crying. She reveled in being present for the moments she had once missed: school recitals, graduations, weddings. Every hug, every smile, every shared meal was a treasure. As the years went by, Angela aged gracefully, her hair turning silver, her steps slowing, but her spirit remained unshakable. She often sat on her porch in the evenings, watching the sun set, her heart full. When neighbors passed by, they would greet her warmly, calling her Miss Angela, the woman whose story had inspired them all. She would smile and wave, sometimes offering advice, sometimes just listening. She had become more than a survivor. She had become a pillar of hope in her community. Angela often said that she didn't regret taking in those 3 children, even though it had led to the hardest years of her life. "If I had the chance to do it all over again," she told them once, "I'd still take you in, because love is never wasted, and you were worth every struggle, every sacrifice." Tears filled their eyes as they hugged her tightly, reminding her that they felt the same, that she had been worth everything to them too. Her story lived on, not just in books or speeches, but in the lives of everyone she touched. The children she saved became her greatest legacy, carrying her lessons into the world, building futures rooted in the love she had once given them. And long after Angela was gone, her name remained a reminder that one act of kindness can echo across decades, changing not just lives, but generations. Angela Williams proved that even when the world is unjust, even when hope seems lost, love can still prevail. She proved that family isn't always about blood, it's about who shows up, who sacrifices, who loves without condition. And most of all, she proved that kindness never dies. Angela's story did not end with her freedom. In many ways, it was only the beginning. The years she had spent behind bars could never be returned. But the impact she made after her release grew far beyond what even she could have imagined. Her children were determined that the world would never again forget her name, and that the injustices she had suffered would fuel change for others. Together, they carried her mission forward, making Angela's life not just a story of survival, but a movement of transformation. Marcus, now a respected defense attorney, became a leading voice in the fight against wrongful convictions. He used his own mother's case as an example in lectures, conferences, and interviews, showing how easily the system could destroy an innocent life. Law schools invited him to speak, advocacy groups sought his expertise, and young lawyers saw him as a mentor. But Marcus always insisted that he was not the true hero. The real strength, he told them, comes from the woman who never gave up on us and who gave us the courage to fight for her. He dedicated his career to her, and with every case he won, he felt as though he was continuing the fight she had once waged silently from her prison cell. Denise's career as a journalist skyrocketed after the release of her book on Angela's life. The book became required reading in universities, and it was even adapted into a documentary that won awards and was screened around the country. In the film, Angela's voice echoed as she recounted her struggles, her sacrifices, and her love for her children. Viewers wept, angry at the injustice, inspired by her resilience. Denise used every platform she had to push for reform, and she always brought her mother along, ensuring the world saw the woman behind the words. Angela was no longer a faceless statistic. She was a living, breathing testimony. Jamal, the community organizer, expanded his reach, using Angela's story to rally people across cities and states. He helped build coalitions that pushed for legislation addressing wrongful convictions and support for families torn apart by the justice system. He took Angela with him to meetings with lawmakers, where she spoke directly to those in power. Her presence alone was enough to silence rooms. When she spoke of the years stolen from her, of the countless women she had left behind in prison who were still fighting for their freedom, even hardened politicians listened. Angela's words carried a weight no statistics or reports ever could. One of the most powerful moments came when Angela was invited to testify before Congress, sitting in a chamber filled with lawmakers, cameras, and reporters. She shared her story in a calm but unwavering voice. She spoke not only of her own suffering, but of the countless others who had no one to fight for them. I am free today because 3 children I once saved refused to let me be forgotten, she said. But there are so many others still waiting for someone to fight for them. We cannot let their lives be wasted as mine nearly was. Her testimony led to the introduction of reforms aimed at increasing oversight of prosecutors and providing more support for the wrongfully convicted. Angela's influence reached beyond the United States. Human rights groups from around the world invited her to speak. She traveled with her children to conferences in Europe, Africa, and Asia, where she shared her story as part of a global conversation about justice and compassion. Audiences were struck not just by her suffering, but by her refusal to become bitter. She always ended her speeches with the same words: "Love saved me, and love will save us all." Despite the recognition and the accolades, Angela remained humble. She still lived simply in the same community where she had once struggled, choosing not to distance herself from the people who needed her most. She spent her mornings tending to a small garden, her afternoons mentoring young women, and her evenings surrounded by her family. When neighbors asked her why she didn't move somewhere bigger or more comfortable, she would smile and say, "This is where I was needed then, and this is where I'm needed now." Her home became a gathering place filled with the warmth of family, activists, students, and community members. On weekends, people crowded into her living room, listening to her speak, sharing their struggles, and drawing strength from her presence. To many, Angela wasn't just a former prisoner or a public figure, she was a mother figure, a guiding light, someone who understood their pain and gave them hope. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Angela sat with her children and reflected. On her journey, she looked at Marcus, Denise, and Jamal, her eyes shining with pride. "When I took you in all those years ago, I thought I was saving you," she said softly. "But the truth is, you saved me. Even before you freed me from prison, you gave my life meaning. You gave me something worth fighting for." They listened in silence, overcome with emotion, until Jamal finally said, "Mama, you gave us love when we had nothing. That love shaped us, and now we're just giving it back." As Angela aged, her health began to decline, but her spirit never wavered. Even when she grew too weak to travel, her children carried her voice forward. Marcus continued to fight in the courts. Denise wrote and spoke on stages, and Jamal organized communities, all in her name. They often called her before big events, asking for her blessing, and she always gave it with a smile and a reminder. Remember, love first, always love first. When she passed away peacefully years later, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, the world mourned. Thousands attended her funeral, and millions watched online as her story was retold once more. People remembered her not as a victim of injustice, but as a woman who had transformed tragedy into triumph. Her children stood at her funeral, strong and united, carrying her legacy forward. Angela Williams left behind more than a story. She left behind a movement built not on anger, but on love. A movement that proved one act of kindness could ripple through time, changing lives, shaping futures, and rewriting destinies. Her name remains a beacon, a reminder that even in the darkest nights, the light of compassion can never be extinguished. And just as her children once said to her, the world now says to her memory, "You saved us." Angela's passing left a silence that echoed through her community, but it also left a legacy that was louder than ever. Though her physical presence was gone, her spirit lived on in her children, her grandchildren, and the countless people she had touched throughout her life. The seeds she had planted, acts of kindness, lessons of resilience, and the power of unconditional love, continued to bloom long after she was gone. Her grandchildren, who had grown up hearing stories of their grandmother's strength, carried her fire inside them. They had not lived through the cold nights on the streets or the long years behind prison walls, but they had lived through the love she poured into her family after her release. They remembered her cooking meals, telling stories on the porch, reminding them to always choose compassion even in a world that could be cruel. They saw her not as a woman broken by prison, but as a matriarch who had turned pain into power. One of her granddaughters, Maya, was deeply inspired by Angela's journey. She pursued a career in social work, determined to help children who had been abandoned or forgotten by society. Every time she sat with a scared child in foster care, she remembered her grandmother's words. Family isn't about blood, it's about love. It's about showing up when no one else will. Maya carried those words like a compass, guiding her decisions and shaping the lives of the children she helped. Another grandchild, Elijah, followed in Marcus's footsteps and studied law. He told his professors and classmates that his passion came from a promise to his grandmother that no innocent person should ever lose years of their life the way she had. He often spoke about her case in class, pointing out the flaws in the justice system and challenging others to think critically about fairness. For him, becoming a lawyer was not just a career, it was a mission. Even those not related by blood carried Angela's legacy. The young people she had mentored after her release, teenagers from troubled homes, single mothers struggling to get by, and young men teetering on the edge of the same streets that had once nearly claimed her children, kept her lessons alive. They told stories of how Miss Angela had listened when no one else would, how she had believed in them when they couldn't believe in themselves. Many of them grew into leaders in their own right, building programs, nonprofits, and businesses that reflected the values she had instilled in them. Angela's influence reached far beyond her own family. Universities established scholarships in her name, designed to support students studying criminal justice reform, journalism, and community organizing, the very paths her children had taken. Every year, scholarship recipients stood on stage, receiving their awards, while Angela's story was retold to inspire the next generation. Her children often attended these ceremonies, reminding students that their mother had once been an ordinary woman who chose love, and that same choice had transformed not just 3 lives, but thousands. Her story also became part of classrooms across the country. Teachers used her life as an example of perseverance, justice, and compassion. Students who had never met her grew up inspired by her courage, writing essays and giving speeches about how one act of kindness could change the world. In history and social studies classes, Angela's case was studied alongside other landmark stories of injustice and reform. She had become more than a woman. She had become a lesson, a symbol, a piece of history. In her old neighborhood, a mural was painted in her honor. It showed Angela with her arms open wide, children gathered around her, a beam of light breaking through prison bars in the background. Beneath it were the words she had spoken so often: love first, always love first. The mural became a gathering place, a site where community members left flowers, notes, and candles. On the anniversary of her release, people came together, there to celebrate her life, to share their own stories of resilience, and to keep her memory alive. Her children continued the work she had inspired. Marcus established a foundation dedicated to providing legal aid for the wrongfully convicted. Denise expanded her journalism into global advocacy, ensuring Angela's story was not forgotten while amplifying the voices of others still fighting for justice. Jamal built a national network of community organizers, connecting cities across the country in the fight for equality and reform. Each of them carried her love like a torch, passing it on to everyone they encountered. Angela's absence was felt most deeply in the quiet moments holidays when her chair at the table sat empty. Family gatherings where her laughter was missing. But even then, her presence lingered in every embrace, every meal shared, every story told. Her family often said they could still hear her voice, reminding them to be kind, to fight for what was right, to never give up on love. Years later, when people spoke of Angela Williams, they didn't just speak of the injustice she endured. They spoke of the lives she had saved, the movements she had inspired, and the generations she had touched. Her story was no longer just about a woman who had taken in 3 children and later been freed by them. It had become a story about how love, once set in motion, can never truly die. Her legacy stretched across decades, carried by her family, her community, and countless strangers who had found hope in her journey. And as long as her story was told, Angela lived on, not behind prison walls, not defined by injustice, but as a beacon of compassion and strength. Because in the end, Angela Williams had proved a simple truth. When you choose love, you plant seeds that grow long after you are gone. Angela Williams's life was never about the struggles she faced, but about how she responded to them. She had every reason to give up poverty, injustice, betrayal by a system meant to protect. Yet she never stopped believing in love. That belief was the thread that carried her through sleepless nights, empty cupboards, and prison walls. It was the same belief that made her open her door to 3 homeless children, even when she had so little herself. For many, her story is remembered as a tale of injustice, corrected after 25 long years. But for those who knew her, it was always more than that. It was about her ability to see the best in people, to find light in the darkest places, and to give when she had nothing left to give. Angela didn't just raise 3 children, raised hope, resilience, and an unshakable faith in humanity. The 3 children she saved, now adults with families of their own, continued to honor her in everything they did. At every milestone, graduations, weddings, new beginnings, they spoke of the woman who had made it all possible. Their children, Angela's grandchildren, grew up not just hearing about her, but carrying her in their daily lives. They carried her in their kindness to strangers, in their fight for justice, and in their love for one another. Her name appeared in newspapers, books, and documentaries. Universities studied her case. Communities painted her face on walls. But the truest tribute to Angela wasn't in headlines or ceremonies. It was in the lives she had touched, the love she had multiplied, the future she had changed forever. Years after her passing, one of her grandchildren, standing before a crowd at a community event, said something that captured it all. My grandmother taught us that when you save one life, you save an entire future. She saved us, and through us, she saved thousands more. Her story doesn't end with hurt, continues with everyone who chooses to love when it's hardest. That is Angela's real legacy. Not a woman defined by a sentence she didn't deserve. Not a victim of a broken system, but a mother, a warrior, and a light in the darkness. When people look back at her life, they don't see tragedy, they see triumph. They see a woman who, against all odds, proved that love can outlast injustice, outshine pain, and outlive death itself. Angela Williams's story will forever remind the world that one act of kindness can ripple across decades, across generations, and across lives yet to be lived. She once thought she was saving 3 children from the cold streets. But those children grew into the very people who would save her from a lifetime behind bars. And long after the prison doors opened, long after the crowds cheered her release, long after her final breath, the truth remained. Angela's choice to love first changed the world, because sometimes the greatest revolutions don't come from power or wealth. They come from a single human heart that refuses to stop loving.